Okay, well, let me start by thanking Professor Sekulovski for inviting me. It is such a thrill to be here. Feels like coming home in Tokyo, like coming back to Temple, which is quite unexpected. And I'm really excited to be talking about Margaret Cavendish with all of you. So let's get started. So here's the plan for what I want to talk about tonight. To start off by introducing a puzzle about color. The puzzle goes something like this. Most of us assume, like I definitely assume, that physical objects are colored. Like I think that bananas are yellow, apples are red or green, oranges are orange. And yet, many experts and authorities, so like color scientists, philosophers, people who think long and hard about this stuff, deny that. They think that color isn't real, that it's this kind of like weird, subjective human illusion. So there's a kind of tension between what I think is like the default view for many of us and what some reflections suggest. And I want to unpack that. I want to understand why it has come to seem so obvious to many of these experts, color scientists and philosophers, that objects aren't colored. And to do that, we're going to have to do some history of philosophy. So we're going to go back to the early modern period, so like 17th, 18th century. And that's when people really got into this idea that objects aren't colored. And I'm going to try to understand that. There's one important exception to that consensus that emerges in the early modern period, Margaret Cavendish. So she's one of the few philosophers writing the period who was like, no, objects are colored. Like, the balloon is red, the banana is yellow, and I'm going to convince you that that's true. So I'm really interested in her. I'm going to look at two arguments that purport to show that objects aren't colored, and then we'll think about how Margaret Cavendish responds to them. And I'll say a little piece about her alternative view of the world. Okay, so we ordinarily assume that physical objects are colored. See some people shaking their head, some people nodding. But let me try to like convince you that that's not a crazy thing to think anyway. So let's consider a red balloon. Consider a red balloon. I think it's probably red. This doesn't seem like a crazy assumption. Why not? Well, for one thing, the balloon looks red. We typically trust our eyes. Seeing is believing, maybe. It's not maybe super persuasive. Maybe this is a little bit more compelling. The balloon looks just as red as it looks spherical. And most people don't really doubt that objects have shape. So if there's a difference in the reality of color and the reality of shape, it's not something that really shows up in our visual experience of the world. Like you look at the balloon, it looks red and spherical. Both of those seem like real properties of the balloon. Why else might you think that the balloon is really red? Well, my gosh, color is big business. People have heard about the company Pantone. So they spend like a huge amount of money and like effort every year trying to figure out what colors are going to be big next year. And you can buy their annual forecast for like $800. If you're curious, the color for 2018 is ultraviolet. But maybe here's the most important reason for thinking that physical objects are really colored. Well, we mostly agree on how to identify an object's real color. Like, ask an expert at Pantone. We have pretty well established ways of settling disagreements about what color an object has. So, contrast color in this context to tastiness. Seems like we don't have any way of settling disputes about whether pizza tastes good, right? Like, if it tastes good to me, Tastes bad to you, that's it. You don't really have any way of resolving that disagreement. Color is different. It seems like in at least some cases, we have ways of deciding what color an object really is, and that seems to presuppose that objects have some kind of real or true color. So here's this like ridiculous little conversation that I had with someone named Sally. So I look at this balloon. It's like, gosh, that balloon looks red to me. Sally says, I don't think so. Looks white. Definitely red, Colin says. Sally, I know what's going on. You're wearing red tinted lenses. That's why it looks red to you. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. I take off my red tinted lenses. The balloon is really white after all. So it seems like we agree that if I'm wearing red tinted lenses and Sally's not, she's got the real color. So it seems like we're kind of on board with this idea that things have a real or true color. Okay, so those were supposed to be like 3 quick and dirty reasons to think that the red balloon is red. And yet, so here's the second half of the puzzle. Many experts and authorities, scientific and philosophical, on color assume that things are not really colored. Moreover, they take it as being pretty obvious that physical objects aren't colored. So that's my reaction, like, what? How can it be that the balloon is not red? So here's a nice passage from a cognitive scientist and psychologist, Stephen Palmer, writing on this topic. People universally believe that objects look colored because they are colored, just as we experience them. The sky looks blue because it is blue. Grass looks green because it is green. And blood, or the balloon, looks red because it is red. As surprising as it may seem, these beliefs are fundamentally mistaken. Neither objects nor lights are actually colored in anything like the way we experience them. So I find that kind of shocking. So what is Stephen Palmer saying? Well, in a nutshell, he's saying that our experience of color is a massive illusion. And now I need to apologize for my terrible drawing skills. So the only way I know how to do philosophy is to draw lots of pictures. I usually do it on the board, but I spent a lot of time last night in Apple Paint, and this is the best that I could do. So this is Palmer's view of what the world is like. We've got the balloon floating out there in the world, isn't really colored. I have an experience of the balloon that's supposed to be the thought bubble as red, but there's a kind of mismatch there, right? Like, the only thing that's really red in this scenario is the way I experience or perceive the balloon. So what these color scientists are saying is that we're all subject to this massive, universal, ubiquitous illusion, right? Like look at the world, like look at the room around you. You see colors everywhere. If Palmer and the other color scientists are right, that's not true. That's an illusion. It's like seeing like unicorns and like elves dancing around everywhere. They're not there. So, interestingly, it's not just the color scientists who think this. Many philosophers agree. And my experience teaching this material back on main campus is that many Temple students buy into this picture of the world as well. So I would be interested to hear from you all what you think. Okay, so here's how I like to think about this puzzle. I think many of us kind of trust our senses. Like, I think my eyes are telling you what the world is like, more or less. And my eyes tell me that I live in a technicolor world filled with color, like the land of Oz. If the color scientists are right, that's not true. We live in a colorless world like Kansas. Okay. So actually, it's worse than that, right? Like, that picture is kind of misleading as a picture of what the illusion is supposed to be like. Because for our purposes, like the different shades of black, white, and gray are colors as well. So if the color scientists are right, physical objects like the balloon, they're not red, they're not blue, they're not green, they're not black, white, or gray either. So we're supposed to try to imagine physical objects like the balloon, devoid of any color whatsoever, any shade of black, white, or gray. Can you do it? Can anyone actually imagine or conceive a physical object without attributing some kind of color shade to it, even if it's just a shade of gray? So the best that I can do is I close my eyes, and I have a tactile conception of a physical object without any color. But gosh, it's hard, right? It's pretty hard to wrap our head around the idea that there are no colors out there in the world. Okay. Are people kind of clear about the puzzle that I'm interested in? It's kind of like this tension between the way we ordinarily experience the world, looks colored, and what color scientists are telling us the world is really like. So my question here, so my question, I guess it's kind of the question of a historian of philosophy. How did we end up here? More specifically, how did it come to seem so obvious to some people, the color scientists, that something crazy like this could be true? And I'm just taking for granted that it's a pretty wild view. So to answer that question, we're going to have to do some history of philosophy. So we're going to dive back into what gets called the early modern period. So roughly the 17th century, early 18th century. Cards of the table, my personal favorite period in philosophy is awesome. This is when people like Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume are writing. Some of those names ring bells for people? Maybe? Descartes, I think they're Farian. Okay, cool. If you haven't heard of them, then maybe I will try to convince you that they have interesting things to say. So it's in this period that philosophers and scientists start to converge on this idea that our color experience is an illusion. They start to converge on the idea that physical objects are not really colored. Somehow that seemed like the best visual depiction that I had of a colorless world. So that is my mind being blown as well. Okay, so it's in the early modern period that this idea of a colorless world really picks up steam. There are historical antecedents for this idea. I feel intellectually obliged to tell you about at least one of them. So in the 5th century BCE, way back, Democritus, ancient atomist, suggests something like this. So he writes, by convention sweet, and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void. So, how long ago was that? 2,500 years ago?
Atomist.
Yeah, so atomist, that's kind of wild. And also he has this idea that sweet, convention, bitter, hot, cold, those aren't really real. Those are just in us somehow, a matter of convention. The only things that are really real, atoms bouncing around in the void. He's kind of a minority figure for about 2,000 years. In the 16th century, people are like, hold on, he was onto something. See this incredible consensus emerge. So Galileo is an important figure in this tradition. He's one of the first people in the early modern period. He's like, hold on, we should not be thinking that colors are really out there. So here's Galileo. Hence, I think that these tastes, odors, colors, etc., on the side of the object, which they seem to exist, are nothing else than mere names. So when I say the balloon is red, that's just language, just a mere name. Rather, these qualities, color, taste, odor, hold their residence solely in the perceiver, so that if the perceiver were removed, every such quality would be abolished and annihilated. So Galileo is saying that color, like beauty, exists only in the eye of the beholder. And he draws out an interesting consequence of that. So if you think that color only exists in us, in our experience, take away the perceivers, and there's no more color. So if we were all to go extinct, heaven forbid, there would be no more color. René Descartes, does that ring bells for people? One of my favorites. He agrees. He thinks that we have gone really, really wrong if we think that the self-same whiteness or greenness which I perceive through my senses is present in the body. And by body, he just means material thing, like physical objects like a moon. So another really sad picture. Descartes says, no. What's wrong with this picture? Well, in this picture, you have the very same greenness existing in a tree and in my visual experience. So this is supposed to be something like the common sense view, that there's a resemblance between our experience of color and what the object is really like. And Descartes is just like, no, that is not how it is. It's like this. It's like Palmer again, right? Palmer being the color scientist. There's the tree that in itself is colorless. It has properties like size, shape, position, solidity, no color. And then there's this kind of human illusion, and that's all greenness is. And then towards the end of this period, David Hume gives a nice summary of this consensus. I'm going to skip over that. Okay. So people with me so far. So trying to trace the history of this idea that physical objects are colorless. And I think that's a weird idea. And I've said that to find the historical origins of the idea, like that really becomes a thing, like becomes mainstream, is in the early modern period. And I think there is this really impressive convergence. Not everybody agrees in the period, and there's one important and really interesting exception to this claim. Okay. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. So she's this really interesting and exciting outlier in the early modern period who's trying to resist the idea that the blue isn't red. She's trying to hold on to the idea that it is red. So she defends the view that physical objects are colored in the way that they ordinarily appear to be. She tells us we can trust our eyes. So she thinks that the balloon is red in precisely the way it needs to be. So that's Cavendish. We have like the redness in the balloon and in our visual experience. Has anyone heard of Cavendish before? Many people haven't. That's totally cool. Many people who have, done a philosophy major, done a PhD in philosophy, haven't heard about Margaret Cavendish, or many of the other women writing about philosophy in the early modern period. And this is kind of shocking, because it turns out that there were actually tons of women in this period who were doing really exciting philosophical work. So Margaret Cavendish is one. Elizabeth of Bohemia is another. She corresponds with Descartes and really takes him to task. Anne Conway, Mary Estelle, Lady Masham. So there's this incredible group of early modern women who get excluded from our histories and our classes, and who have just sort of been written out of the history of philosophy. And that's a shame. It turns out that they have interesting, exciting, insightful things to say. So kind of one of the subtexts in my talk is hey, pay attention to early modern philosophy, and don't forget the early modern women philosophers. Okay. So here's where we are. Majority of early modern philosophers hold that physical objects are not really colored. Cavendish is an exception. So it seems like we have a version of that puzzle I started with playing out in the early modern period, where Cavendish is kind of speaking up for common sense, ordinary experience, and the majority of early modern philosophers are arguing for this surprising view. So I want to dig into this disagreement. In philosophy, we're not just interested in the positions that people hold, the views they advance. We want to know why. We want to reconstruct the arguments that we can give for thinking various things. So the questions that I'm interested in for the remainder of the talk are, what arguments did the majority use to argue that objects are not really colored? So why might you actually think that? I haven't given you any reasons to think that yet. And how does Cavendish resist these arguments? Okay, so one family of arguments that get used pretty frequently are what I call arguments from relativity. So one common strategy used in the early modern period is to argue that physical objects can't really be colored because color exhibits various surprising kinds of relativity. One kind of relativity is what I call light relativity. You are very familiar with this. This is just the idea that objects can appear to be pretty different colors in different illumination conditions. And the thought is something like, if color can change that much, as it moves from one circumstance to the next, the color can't really be the object. Second kind of relativity, perceiver relativity. You also note this. If you have colorblind friends, the blue might look red to me, green to you. Doesn't seem like any of us have more insight into what color the balloon really is. So we might conclude that there's not really any color there at all. Okay. I'm going to focus on light relativity because this is where I think Cavendish gets really interested. You might also call it color constancy. So I've already said this. An object's apparent color can vary dramatically depending on how it is illuminated. So here's my favorite example. So let's say you try on a pair of jeans in the change room. You're like, awesome, they look black. I really want some black jeans. So you buy the jeans. You think, great, I've got these black jeans. Black, they're going to match my black shirt. You get outside, disaster. In daylight, the jeans turn out to be navy blue. Doesn't this happen to other people? Maybe you're better at buying clothes than I am. Here's another example. White wall, illuminated in white light, looks white. Very same wall, in red light, looks red. Bathed in blue light, looks blue, etc. Right? So you can manipulate the colors objects look to have just by shining different kinds of lights on them. So you might think, there's not really any color in the object. It's just we're responding to different kinds of light. Okay. So here's a way of making that intuitive idea a little bit more precise. Okay, so we're all on board with that first step, right? Objects appear to have different colors relative to different locations. The jeans look black in the change room, navy blue in sunlight. But it doesn't seem like there's any principled reason to privilege one kind of illumination over another, right? I might say that sunlight reveals the true color of the jeans, but why think that? So here's a little thought experiment. Imagine that we live on a different planet where the sun is red and everything is constantly bathed in reddish light. If we lived in that world, we would think that everything looks kind of normal when it's bathed in red. So why think that our sun, the sun that we just kind of coincidentally happen to have, tells us what colors objects really have? So that you might conclude, look, objects don't have any one true or real color, and hence aren't colored at all. Thought of something like, if objects did have a real color, there would be some sort of lighting condition that would reveal it. But it doesn't seem like there is any privileged one true lighting condition that allows object color to shine through. So we conclude that objects don't have any real color. People have a sense of how that argument is supposed to work? Okay, we can discuss more in Q&A. So I think Cavendish's response to this argument is kind of ingenious. So she suggests a way of redescribing the phenomenon. So the early modern majority say, when you take those genes from the change room to daylight, it looks like the color changes. And then they're like, if color's that fickle, it can't really be an object. Cavendish suggests a different way of thinking about this. She suggests that what's happening is it looks like the color remains stable and the lighting changes. She's like, yeah, something is changing in your experience, but it's not the color of the object that looks like it's changing, it's just the lighting. You knew that was changing all along. She's actually way ahead of her time. She's pointing to what psychologists now call color constancy. So look at this mug. It's illuminated in pretty different ways, right? Like half of the mug is in shadow, the other half is in pretty bright light. But we look at it, and we can all tell that that mug is one color, right? Like it's a uniform shade of red. What does it look like? It looks like a uniformly colored mug illuminated in slightly different ways. Is that right for other people? I guess I don't want to tell you what you see. Like if you saw that picture, would you like, that's a red mug? You wouldn't think that that was a striped mug. Let's do a show of hands. Who thinks that they can tell that that's a uniformly colored mug if they look at that picture? Okay, so at least we share Cavendish's intuition. So she thinks that what's going on here is we're seeing objects that look like they have a stable uniform color that are then just being illuminated in different ways. We can kind of tell the difference between illumination and object. So here's a little passage from Cavendish where she expresses this idea. We see that natural and inherent colors, so like the color of the mug, continue always the same, but the position and reflection of light is as well. So Cavendish makes this point by imagining what it would be like if colors appear to change with every variation in illumination conditions. Just this great thought experiment. So just like imagine a parrot. You're hanging out with this parrot around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun is going down, the light is fading. If color really changed, looked like it was changing with illumination conditions, it would look like the parrot was becoming a crow. But that doesn't happen. We can tell that it's a parrot and it's just getting darker, right? Like there's a difference between a parrot whose colors you can't really discern and like a blackbird. Okay, so I think that argument from light relativity seems pretty persuasive at first. And I think Cavendish has this ingenious way of like questioning its presupposition, namely that it's really the color that looks like it's changing in different illumination conditions. So that's one kind of argument for relativity. There are a whole bunch. Many early moderns appeal to what you might think of as perceiver relativity. So balloon looks red to me, looks green to you. Red to me, green to you. I'm going to skip over this and leave this as like an exercise for the crowd. Sorry, bad news, homework. Think about this. How would you appeal to perceiver relativity to construct an argument for the claim that objects aren't really colored? How might Cavendish respond? If people have ideas in like 15 minutes, we can talk about it in the Q&A, which would be really exciting. Okay. So let me just remind you where we are. Started with this puzzle. The balloon looks red. Color scientists are telling us that that's wrong. How did we end up here? Go back to the early modern period. Turns out that's where people get excited about this idea that the physical world is colorless. We've seen one argument for that claim that appealed to light relativity. I'm now going to look at the second main argument of the strategy that is supposed to show that physical objects are not colored, that is supposed to show that the balloon isn't really red. And this argument appeals to explanation, hence arguments from explanation. Okay, so here's the basic idea, and I'm going to explain this in a few different ways because it's a little bit tricky. The basic idea is that we can fully explain why we see objects as if they were colored, without assuming that objects really are color. And if we can fully explain why we see them as color, without attributing color to objects, then it seems like attributing color to objects doesn't really explain anything, doesn't do any work for us, doesn't do any explanatory work for us, and so we should just get rid of that idea. Okay. So you see this kind of argument, people like Descartes, Hobbes, Boyle, Locke. But let's unpack. And I think the best way to unpack this argument is to work through an analogy. So let us consider the tooth fairy. And I was really hoping to find a great image of the tooth fairy, but I lost my internet connection at a crucial moment. Okay, so when I was young, I believed in the tooth fairy. Why? Well, because whenever I lost a tooth, put it under my pillow, next morning there was a loonie. And that is a Canadian dollar coin. It seemed like the only possible explanation for this was the tooth fairy. So it's like, here's this phenomenon. Tooth coin. What could explain that? Seems like the tooth fairy is a pretty good explanation. So I believed in the tooth fairy. I believed in the tooth fairy because she did explanatory work, right? Like she explained something about my experience that needed to be explained. Okay, but eventually I had to put aside these childish explanations. I came to realize that there was a better explanation for what was going on. My parents, right? Like eventually I was like, my parents are the ones who are taking the tooth and replacing it with a coin. So I stopped believing in the tooth fairy. Why? Because the tooth fairy didn't explain anything for me anymore, right? Like I could give a complete account of my world without assuming that the tooth fairy existed. And I think we kind of have this presupposition that you shouldn't believe in extra weird stuff for no reason, right? Like you shouldn't believe in the tooth fairy unless you have some good reason to believe in the tooth fairy. You shouldn't believe in the tooth fairy unless positing the tooth fairy explains something about your life. And that kind of principle, do not posit entities unnecessarily, sometimes gets called Occam's for a medieval philosopher in Occam. Okay. So that's supposed to be a reconstruction of like the reasoning that I went through, right? Like I can fully explain the switch without believing in a tooth fairy. Shouldn't just believe in the tooth fairy because therefore the tooth fairy does not exist. Okay, so in the early modern period, many of the early modern mainstream tried to formulate a similar argument to show that physical objects are not really color. In other words, that colors are as fictional as the tooth fairy. How's that going to work? Okay. Like 30-second history of color lesson. Before the early modern period, people thought that you needed to assume that objects are color to explain how we experience them. So for like about more than 1,000 years, people had this idea that there was like color out in the balloon. Copies of that color get transmitted through the medium. The air or water gets picked up by your eye, and that produces the experience of red. So before the early modern period, people thought that the only way you could explain how you have an experience of color is if there's color in the world. So it's like, before the early modern period, people thought the only way you could explain the switch of the tooth for the coin was in terms of the tooth fairy. And then eventually people were like, no, we can do better than that. People became convinced that everything in the physical world could be explained just in terms of matter and motion. So a little bit like Democritus, right? In the 5th century BCE, everything can be explained in little bits of matter bouncing around. This view is often called the mechanical hypothesis because it treats of nature as a giant machine. So this is my insane diagram of how they thought you could explain color. So you have a light source that is emitting motion through the air. We talk about wavelengths, they talk about motion. That motion would be reflected off the balloon, The motion would travel through the air towards my eyes, stimulate my sense organs. There would be a motion transmitted through my nerves into my brain, and then, pow, I would have a visual experience of color. So notice one thing about this explanation. At no point did I mention color in the objects, right? Like when I was explaining how that visual experience happened, I just talked about motion, right? There's like motion being emitted from the light source, motion reflected off the balloon, motion happening in my like retina visual system and nerves, and then pow, visual experience of red. But before that pow moment, there's no color. So in terms of the tooth fairy example, it's like this explanation in terms of motion is like my parents, right? So my parents explain the transformation of tooth to coin. Motion explains the occurrence of a visual experience of red. Is that see the difference? The key idea is that they think they can explain how it is we have visual experiences of color without assuming that there are any colors out in the world. Okay, now go through that. Said that. That was the bam moment. When you see the red. Apparently I was really excited about that. Kept saying it. Okay, so here's the crucial point. We shouldn't believe in the tooth fairy because the tooth fairy doesn't explain anything. And it seems like we shouldn't believe that the balloon is red because that doesn't explain anything either, right? Because we explained everything about our visual experience just in terms of matter and motion and the way that matter and motion interacts with our visual systems. Okay. So if you thought that was a good argument in the tooth fairy case, you should probably think that it's a good argument in the color case as well. Has anyone stopped believing in color in the last like 30 seconds? Okay, I will try harder. Or not. I'm not sure who wins. Okay. But I think that's a pretty good argument, right? Like good work. I think Cavendish has a pretty interesting response to this argument as well. And her strategy is to question whether her opponents have really given a full explanation of the perceiver's visual experience of color. And her question is about, well, how is it even possible to have a visual experience of red at all? Let me go back a little bit. I need a diagram. I don't know. Okay. So I need to stand up for some reason. So Cavendish's question is, how is that possible? How do you get red in the thought bubble? How can red exist in your experience, in your mind as a representation, if there's no red in the physical world? And I think that's a pretty good question, right? Like, how is it that we're so much capable of thinking or experiencing red? And you can ask the kind of question about almost anything, right? Like, I think you can ask, how is it possible we're capable of thinking about numbers? Or God, or the soul? So I think that's a fair question. And she makes it a little bit more pointed, like this. So Cavendish thinks of visual experience and perception more generally, like a mirror. So she thinks that our visual experience reflects the world. And just as a mirror can't reflect something that isn't there, visual experience can't represent something unless that general type of thing exists in reality. So she's thinking of our visual experience, our perception, as kind of like a photocopier, right? It's just like copying the world. And if that's the right way to think about visual experience, well, then you couldn't have the visual experience of red unless there were some redness existing out there to be copied or reflected. And that Cavendish thinks shows that there have to be physical objects that are actually incredibly red. So I think she's onto something, right? Like, I think we do need an explanation of how redness can be represented by our existing visual experiences. We do need an account of how that thought bubble of red is possible. And the people that she's arguing with haven't really given an explanation. So I kind of think, like, we've got a good argument, but maybe she wins this round. So for Cavendish, the only explanation of how there can even be a thought bubble like that represents or contains redness in the way that experiences do is if there is redness out in the world to be represented, reflected, or copied. Okay, so for Cavendish, objects look red because they're red. And what I like about her view is that for her, colors do explanatory work, right? Like, it's important for her to say that the balloon is really red, because that explains something. That explains how it is that we're capable of having these experiences. And so if you assume that the explanatory is the real, follows the colors are red. So the challenge, if you want to resist Cavendish's theory, right? If you want to like hold on to the colorless world that you have inherited from people like Descartes, Locke, Boyle, Hobbes, is to figure out a way of explaining everything in the perceptual situation, including the thought bubble of red, without ever assuming that objects are red. So she takes us back to a text and color world like Oz, where objects really are color. Maybe that's a good place to stop. Yeah, great, thanks.
I would like to thank you for your attention and thank Professor Chamberlain for this very insightful and I hope new way of presenting the way we see color and learn a bit about the history of how we all ended up here at this point in time with the knowledge we have currently. So let's start with the Q&A. Any comments, questions, whatever you may have, just look for the mic.
Hello. So thank you for your presentation. It's actually very interesting to me because as a previous web designer, I really like playing with colors.
Good.
And I really like taking experiments with colors in terms of the real world to the digital world and how it translates, right? So have you heard of the Philips Hue? The Philips Hue, the lighting system?
Say a little bit more.
The Philips Hue lighting system, it's where you can create an ambience of the room by changing the color.
Yeah.
That's what we know, right?
Yeah.
So just as a thoughtful experiment, yellow and blue becomes green, right? But if you have a blueprint out, if you have a blueprint out and you take the Philips Hue and put it in a yellow room, it actually doesn't create green, which is something very interesting. So it is the perception of color with a light base. However, I believe that everything does have a predefined shade.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a color, but a shade. Because this is, not to try and derail this, but why do you think that in terms of people as physical objects, right? Why is it that we have different skin tones if it's just a perception of light?
Okay, so I feel like there were two parts of that question, right?
Yeah, I didn't want to give it up.
So the first part actually sounded really kind of sympathetic to where Cavendish is coming from. Like, I'm not sure that I totally get the shade color distinction that you're drawing, but you're like, look, there's something like a color that an object has, and that in combination with the illumination conditions determines our visual experience. And it's really important that there be that like color variable in the object. And I think Cavendish is going to be like, yeah, that's right. There's a color in the object, but then our overall visual experience is kind of a combination of object and light. So I think I'm just going to like welcome that suggestion. The second part of your question was provocative. But I think we can maybe kind of like get at the core of what you were asking. Maybe in a less provocative way. So it's like, I think you're wondering if the early modern mainstream, the color scientists are right, and light and our visual experience is just this kind of illusion created by light reflecting. Why do we see objects as roughly the same colors, right? Like, why, when we look at the blue, does it all look red to us, if it's just light and our subjective responses? Well, here's one thing you might think. We're all members of the same species with relatively similar visual systems. We're all picking up roughly the same kind of light that's getting reflected off the balloon. We're all responding it in roughly the same ways. So I just think those kind of like biological commonalities can explain why there would be that kind of uniformity in responses. Even if it were true that objects aren't colored. So now I'm kind of reconstructing how you might insist on the idea that objects aren't really colored, and yet explaining why we all see them the same way. Here's the short answer: because we're all kind of alike. Not totally alike, like there's variation. Some people are colorblind, right? So they have fewer cones, I think. Some people think that some women might have extra cones, and so are sensitive to a wider range of wavelengths, called tetrapromats. So it's like there's some similarity, like biological similarity, but it's not perfect. But I think that's a good question. Thanks.
Professor, I'd like to thank you for coming too. If color is only our perception of things,
Yeah.
what's to say that we all have the same perception?
Do you want me to answer that in like the most general way possible, or
We're all
when it
human.
comes to color? Well, so that's like a first step, right? Like, we're all human beings with the same basic set of perceptual systems. It would be kind of weird if we didn't see things roughly the same way.
Maybe it's taught. Maybe color is taught.
Maybe color is taught, but it seems like, so you teach me what the word red refers to, like tomatoes, but my gosh, that I can take that word and apply it to this incredible wide range of red things that you have never like shown me before. So it seems like at the very least we're sensitive to similarities in color, right? You show me one red thing, and then I'm able to recognize other red things. That makes me think that it's not just a kind of contingent matter of language. Why do I think there's that we see things roughly the same way? We can, I think, agree about a lot. Like, we can agree about what things are the same colors. So maybe I can't convince myself that like your red is exactly like my red. I don't know. But we can both categorize those two chairs as the same color. So it seems like there's at least some kind of structural similarity. So like our classificatory abilities suggest that we have some stuff in common. And then I guess, look, like it's really hard to argue definitively, like beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we see things the same way. But you haven't given me any reason to think that we don't. So I'm not sure like why the default position would be that we do see objects as roughly the same colors until you're given like an argument to think otherwise. So a few thoughts there. Yeah, please.
Going off from that question, when people eat asparagus, they really love it, but when I eat it, it tastes just terrible. So awful, and I can't understand why they're eating it, and unless they're punishing themselves for something, because it tastes so bad. So because of that, maybe that suggests color perceptions could be, you know, what I experience as red in my mind might be something you're experiencing pink or something, or maybe when you eat asparagus, this tastes like chocolate to me, I don't know, but anyway, I also wondered, when they're saying the color is in the mind, there might be something out there in the world that corresponds to something that's making us have this sensation, otherwise there really wouldn't be any reason to have eyes, I guess, but would they have taken something like space and time, you know, those most fundamental organizational principles of our experience, and would they have said the same thing about space and time? Well, there really isn't space and time out there. That's just a principle that's used to organize our experiences, sights and sounds and all of those things. That space and time are really, as Kant said, the organizational principle. Did they say anything about that?
Good. So there's going to be a range of views in this period. Like, I think there's surprising amount of consensus about color, more variety about almost everything else. Pre-Kant, though, most of the early modern philosophers are going to want to say that space and time are real in a way that color is not. More specifically, they're going to want to say that spatial properties and temporal properties are real in a way that color is not. So here's a really important thing about this explanation. So this is the early modern mechanistic explanation. They're explaining everything outside the mind in terms of matter in motion. And they think that that matter is describable in geometric terms. So they're thinking about particles that have a certain size, shape, location. In other words, that have various spatial properties. So it's kind of part of their explanatory story that there are these particles existing outside the mind. And those particles then impinge on us and produce the visual experience of color. So here's the asymmetry, right? Spatial properties like shape, size, position do explanatory work. So if you think the explanatory is the real, then you're going to believe in shape, size, position. Color, they think, doesn't do explanatory work. Two exceptions, Berkeley and Leibniz are going to be idealists about space as well, but they're kind of outliers. So it's important that there's an asymmetry, right? Like there are some properties, shape, size, position, motion, that explain stuff and that they take to be real. And then there are these idle properties, color, also smell, taste, that they think are not explanatory, and then they're like, those are just in the mind, ideal, not real, imaginary. Thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you for the insightful talk. I wanted to ask if she made any argument for other secondary qualities, or like, for example, morality, or perception of goodness or badness. And I'm especially curious because some philosophers of perception today, they relate perceptual experience and morality. For example, John McDowell at Pittsburgh, his theory of perception is closely related to his virtue theory, right? So I was curious if you have any perspective.
Value as a secondary quality. So let me just explain a little bit of the terminology in that question. So one thing you might have noticed in the passages that I put up there from Democritus and Galileo and Hume, they weren't just talking about color, right? They were talking about sound, smell, taste. And they thought all of those properties exist in the mind in this way. I just talked about color because it's kind of a vivid example, but you can make similar arguments with many, many other qualities, and those qualities get lumped together as secondary qualities. Secondary because they kind of have a secondary status, right? Primary qualities, in contrast, are the ones like shape, size, position, solidity that are taken to do explanatory work and to be really the other. So the primary ones are the real ones, secondary qualities are the unreal ones. So that was just a kind of terminological note. Then the next part of the question was like, well, what about value? What about goodness and badness? do those also exist in the mind? So this is one of my favorite questions of all. And I'm just going to give myself a shameless plug. I teach a class on the main campus called Color and Morality that is like about this question. And here's how it goes. All the kinds of arguments that we talked about to show that color isn't real and exists only in the mind, similar arguments can be used to show that goodness and badness are similarly mind-dependent, similarly illusory. So, for example, moral relativity, right? Like, you have your moral views, I have mine. Does it seem like there's any principled way of deciding who's right? So maybe there's no morality out there in the world. It's just like, you have your moral values in your mind, I have mine in mine. So that would be a kind of argument from perceivable relativity for the mind dependence of goodness and badness. You can also do an argument from explanation to show that goodness and badness are unreal. It goes something like this. What explains why you have the moral values that you do? Well, it seems like it's your upbringing. It seems like it's the context in which you grew up, like the things your parents told you, the experiences you had. At no point in that explanatory story do you need to mention the actual existence of moral values, of like objective goodness and badness. So you might end up thinking that goodness and badness are as much like the tooth fairy as color. And that's when I start to get really concerned, and I'm like, no, 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 you've gone too far. But it's really hard to figure out what's wrong with that argument, right? Like, if you think that the explanatory is the real, what do moral values explain? So, in some ways, that's just like a big yes to your question. Cavendish doesn't really talk about the analogy between color and moral values, but there's this tradition in the early modern period that does, especially David Hume, who kind of skimmed it really fast. And he's really explicit that these have the same status. Like, he thinks color is in the mind, morality is just a projection of our feelings or sentiments. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi. So as an art minor, I found it really interesting, your presentation. And also as a psychology major, I found it kind of interesting because in my studies I learned about schematics and basically so how we experience things kind of shapes like how we perceive our future experiences. But I was kind of interested, like I kind of support what she said because basically I know that illusions, like most of us perceive them, like such as the illusion of like these different colored shapes, but there's like this line of shading, so therefore lighting conditions, and how they seem to look like different colors, but because of the lighting, it changes, but it's actually the same color. And so, yeah, I think I support hers, and basically like also as doing art, like changing the colors just by adding black and such. There's actually like, the color of black doesn't make it black per se, so I think that everything kind of has the color, as she says. But I find it interesting how there's other like perspectives about that.
So let me just respond to that briefly. So this is a part of a much larger project that I'm working on. So this is just kind of like the trailer version. So one part of the like mainstream early modern stories, people who want to deny that objects are really colored, puts a huge emphasis on light and the kind of light that objects are reflected. And this is actually like pretty common today for people, at least among people who kind of like default to thinking that science is right without really getting into the details. People think that there's a tight correlation between wavelength and perceived color. People are like, what's color? The wavelength of light that's being reflected. And they're like, well, what is red? It's a specific wavelength of color. What is blue? It's a different kind of wavelength. As you have just pointed out, it's actually way more complicated than that. Like, there's no tight correlation between the specific wavelength of light that an object is reflecting and the color you will perceive it as having. Just as important are like the contrast effects around it. So perceived color is a product both of wavelength, but also the other objects in the vicinity. And it turns out that like Margaret Cavendish is really good about this as well. Like, it's this weird moment where she's like hundreds of years ahead of the time, doesn't know any of the actual color science, just kind of guesses and guesses right. Just like, no. Like, there's no tight correlation between the kind of light reflected and the object's color that we perceive as having. So kind of like, yes. So I guess that's my answer to your remarks. If people want more detail, I can send you the paper version of this or something.
Okay. Thank you for tonight. And like the first thing that popped up in my mind listening to you is a blind person since birth.
Yeah.
And I think that colors go beyond perception. The color is more an idea than perception. So I think that color might exist objectively. Especially because how do you explain a color like red to a blind person since birth? My father used to work like with blind children,
Yeah.
and he said that this was a huge struggle. But anyhow, they had in their mind the concept of red or of blue. Especially they associated red with something else that they may understand with maybe tact or smell.
Mm-hmm.
For example, red was connected with something hot.
Yeah.
So I think that they go beyond perception colors. Because if a blind person since birth that has never seen a color, his or her life, can have an idea, it means that perception is not color and color is not perception.
So I feel like we just want to know more about the case, right? Like, what is the evidence for thinking that these blind children have an understanding of color despite never having seen it? I mean, here's one thing it could mean. They have learned more or less when it's appropriate to apply color terms. Like, if people keep telling you that strawberries are red, then you're like, you have ways of finding out that it's strawberry, and you're like, oh, it's red. And then you can imagine they come to have associations, like, when they heard the word red, they might think strawberries. What are some other red things? Rubies. So I guess I don't know what to make of that case exactly, because I'm not sure what reason there is to think that they really understood color. And then let's say that maybe weirdly they did understand color. What would that show? Would that show that color exists in objects? Would that show that color is an illusion? I'm not sure. Like, maybe it would show that color is an illusion that's hardwired in some way. So super interesting example. Not sure how to think about it, and I'm not sure that it would really like determine the question that I've tried to present today, namely like, is the balloon really red? But if there's a connection there, like, tell me. If someone has a way of like finding that. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. One argument you talked about was about photons and particles.
Oh yeah.
Would another argument possibly be the linguistic argument, which instead of coming from the field of science comes from the field of philosophy? Primarily like...
Say a little bit more.
Like, I don't know if I'm using the words correctly, but like linguistic analytic philosophy, you'd see the argument that maybe, let's say you have an indigo balloon and a purple balloon, somebody from a different culture would just see them as the same color.
Yeah.
Red's not a very good example because most cultures do have a word for red, but it seems like there might be a linguistic argument which
Yeah, good.
comes from the field of philosophy instead of just, you said, like just trusting science, so that, sorry. Anyways, I'm just wondering if there's
Yeah.
a counter argument that exists there too.
So let me be clear, like, I'm a big fan of science. Like,
Yeah.
I think, like, I don't think you can talk about color in a meaningful way without engaging with the relevant bits of science. Like, you need to learn about the way objects interact with light, the way our eyes work, the way our brains process that information. What I want to resist is any straightforward inference from everything that those experiments tell us about the true nature of color. Whereas I think people sometimes move really, really fast from thinking like, our visual experience results in part from wavelengths being reflected, to the conclusion, objects aren't colored. And I just want to say, you need to work harder. Like, maybe there's an argument that connects that idea that reflected wavelengths of light produce color to the conclusion that objects aren't really colored. But you need to make the argument. Like, you can't just kind of like jump to that conclusion. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that I'm like generally skeptical.
I wasn't thinking specifically about science. I was talking about the idea of the linguistic argument.
Yeah,
against this.
okay, good.
Is there an argument that could be made there?
Yeah, so
That red only exists as something that comes from language?
people have looked at cross-cultural variation in color terms, which you kind of gestured at. And like different languages have, unsurprisingly, different color terms, right? But they also divide like the spectrum up differently. So I can't remember the exact examples, but you know, they might have yellow green and then also another word for yellowish green. And maybe they're like faster at making differentiations corresponding to the terms they use. So there's a phenomenon.
So then making the argument that it only exists linguistically is a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, I guess like, I think maybe you can make that argument, but there are more steps, right? So here's why I think there are more steps. Let's say different cultures have different words for dogs, right? Like maybe we recognize a lot of different kinds of dogs, like poodles and pugs and French bulldogs. Maybe there's like another culture that's just like dog. So there you similarly have like cross-cultural variation in classificatory schemes. Do I thereby think that dogs are just a kind of linguistic phenomenon? Like, no. The classificatory scheme might be a linguistic phenomenon. So the way we divide up color space, maybe that is just a kind of linguistic artifact. But in the absence of some more argument, I'm kind of inclined to think the space that we're dividing up is not just language in the same way that like dogs exist, regardless of how we sort them into particular breeds.
Would it be fine to continue?
Sure, yeah.
There's ways that I can define what a dog is. I can't define what color is. There's no way that I can define what the color red looks like to somebody who doesn't know what it looks like. Somebody who's blind. I can describe the shape of a dog. I cannot describe any attribute of color.
Oh, sure you can. It's what you see
How do
when
you
you open your eyes.
Describe the color red, please.
It's a lot like the color pink.
Describe it without contrasting it to other colors.
Well, you didn't say that I had to do that.
What is color like? It's not so easy as a dog.
So sure, but there are some things that are indefinable. That doesn't mean that they're not real, that they don't exist outside our minds. So I'm kind of happy to grant that at the end of the day, we'll run out of things to say about color. Like, I won't be able to say anything more. I can say some things. Like, I think it's striking how much we can say. Like, which colors are more like others. And people kind of overlook that. Like, a color, I can't describe it. It's like, no, that's not true. You can say a lot. Like, blue and green are closer to each other than to orange. You can talk about complementary colors, like artists have like really sophisticated ways of talking about color. Sure, you'll get to a point where you can't say anything more. But that's true of like, tell me what time is. Tell me what space is.
I think, well,
tell me what a point. So
I
these
think
are just
all
look
kind of
examples
fall
of
into
things.
the category of, maybe you could all call them qualia. If you could call I was going to ask first if you can call color a qualia.
Maybe I feel like I have a better understanding of what a color is and what qualia are.
Qualia, sorry.
Yeah.
Sensations like pain, time, color, things like that, it seems like these would all fall into that category. I just didn't understand. I didn't really, I was thinking about, this just derives how we see color, but not what we're actually seeing.
Good. I think that's probably right. But there are probably like aspects of reality that to understand them, you need to live them. And I'm kind of okay with the idea, like, maybe that's what reality is like. You can't explain everything. Like, sometimes you just have to experience them. But I'm not sure why that should lead me to conclude. I'm not sure we're making this argument anymore, that color isn't real. Maybe there are like real features of objects that you just need to encounter for yourself. I think we should leave that possibility open.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, through your questions.
Thank you very much for your interesting and very informative presentation, because I didn't know nothing about Margaret Cavendish until today. So I would like to ask you about the motivation. So what kind of motivation drive her to think about the completely the opposite argument?
Yeah.
The philosophers at that time argued the opposite. So what I'd like to know the motivation or reason why she argued that the outside world has its own color.
Yeah. There's kind of a zoomed-in way of answering that question, and then there's a kind of bigger picture way of answering the question. Let me start with the zoomed-in way. This is kind of a philosophical explanation. I think she saw that there were real problems with this colorless view of the world. Her contemporaries like Descartes, Locke, Hobbes were supremely confident that they could fully experience the way we experience objects as color without ever positing color in the world. And I think she rightly saw that their explanation was not as good as they thought it was. And I think she saw problems with many different arguments that they were making. So another argument and strategy to show that objects aren't really colored is a conceptual argument. So people like Galileo and Descartes put a lot of emphasis on the fact that it seems like they can conceive of objects without any color, whereas they can't conceive of objects without size, shape, and position. That somehow showed that objects are really shaped and sized, but not colored. And Cavendish, again, is just like, that argument is not very good. Like, it's actually really hard to conceive or imagine an object without color. So I think there were holes in the argument, and I think she saw them. So that's kind of the zoomed-in philosophical explanation of how she ends up with the view that she does, because she saw there were problems with the alternative. The larger picture is that she is just generally very opposed to this idea that nature is a giant machine. So kind of the rise of the new science in the early modern period sweeps people away, and suddenly everybody is convinced that physical nature, including our bodies, animal, plants, the cosmos, is fully describable in terms of like shape, size, and motion. And I think she's like, that's the wrong way to think about nature. So she kind of has this wild view where she thinks that everything is material. So there are no souls for Margaret Cavendish, everything is material. But everything is also alive and sentient and conscious and rational and knows stuff. So she thinks that like the bottle has a mind of its own and sees the world in a certain way and knows things and has its own motion and its own behavior and explains why it things that it does. So the kind of bigger picture is like she's committed to giving this like radical alternative to the mechanistic worldview that is the dominant strand of philosophy. So she's kind of this maverick along many, many dimensions. Color is one of those dimensions, and that's one that I focus on today. But so maybe the bigger picture answer to your question is, why did she go her own way? That was just what she did. Like you could call her like Margaret Cavendish, philosophical maverick. And that would get something right about her orientation, I think. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
I want to go back to the idea of blindness, because on your presentation you said that a world without colors, it can't exist. Because if I try to think in my mind, erase every single color, also like in the world of Hobbes and then back to, there will be no existence. So what I'm thinking right now is that also blind people, in their thoughts, they think in color. Even though they have never seen them, they can think in color, because colors is what they help, it will help them to distinguish things between them. Because we can distinguish things because they have colors, they have shapes, or anything else. But if everybody in the world will be blind, nobody could give us like what is the notion of something.
Okay, so your question was, I thought you were going to start saying one thing, and then you surprised me by saying almost the opposite. So I've been talking about this like idea of a colorless world, and I've been suggesting that's really hard to conceive of, like to understand, like you have to think about the colorless world. And then I was expecting to say something, well, what about blind people? Like surely they can think about a colorless world because they don't have visual experiences, but they still seem to like differentiate objects just fine and like think about objects. And I think that's an important point. Then you went in a slightly different direction, right? Then you're like, maybe even in that world where you only have blind people, they would be thinking in terms of color because they would need to differentiate objects. So I don't think that people who are blind differentiate objects using colors. There are other ways, right? Like smooth, hard. There are many different kinds of qualities that we can use to differentiate objects. Like close your eyes, and you can still kind of differentiate stuff a little bit, right? It's texture, it's temperature. But here's something to think about. Almost all the qualities that we use to differentiate objects, so visually color, tactually, different textures, temperatures, smooth, wet, those are all going to fall into the category of secondary qualities. So you can present similar arguments as the one we've seen today to argue that like all those tactile qualities are just as mind dependent as color. And I can't help but just like clarify one point now. I have not officially taken a stand on which view is correct. Okay? So I've tried to give you two options, two different ways of thinking about color. And I've tried to kind of sketch some arguments pushing you in one direction. So the two arguments I look at pushed you towards the idea that objects are colorless. And I also tried to give you some like conceptual tools to resist those arguments. I have not told you what to think. And I think it's like your job to take those arguments, take the objections, and if not, figure it out for yourself, decide like which you think is more. So I will try never to tell you what to think. Just what the arguments are. That you need to do like the hard work of deciding.
Thank you for the presentation. So if color doesn't exist, how can this wall of colorful flags make sense to us?
Yeah.
And couldn't we just say like color is, therefore color exists, just like people say I am, therefore I exist.
Yeah.
And also, like you mentioned the company called Pantone,
Yeah.
like doesn't they have a series of number relate to
Yeah.
a specific color? Like you can get different color by inputting different number to the computer. Like doesn't that?
Right.
Yeah.
It's like hard to understand.
Yeah.
Like what is going on there? Like what is going on there?
Yeah.
Unless the wall is colored. Okay. So you were kind of like, you're wearing the Cavendish hat, right? You're saying like, this has got to be right. Like, how could you sincerely doubt that that wall is colored? Okay, so now I need to put on my like early modern Descartes, Galileo, Democritus hat. Well, it's true. It looks colored. And I'm having this like very impressive visual experience right now. Zoom in real close. Consider the different patches that we call different colors. You get in real close, you'll find out that those different patches have slightly different microphysical textures. The different patches reflect light in slightly different ways. And that our visual systems are designed in such a way that we are really sensitive to variations in light. So how could we have this visual experience even though we weren't colored? Well, maybe because that wall is reflecting light in very complicated, subtle, nuanced ways. And our eyes are incredibly sensitive at detecting those differences in reflected light. And then we interpret that kind of like mosaic of light in terms of color. And then they'll be like, and so we've explained everything. What's left over? Like, what's the mystery? What's left over to explain? And I think you still have moves to say, but they're gonna push you hard to articulate something that they can't account for.
One last question.
Thank you for coming. This is going to be a bit of a devil adverse questions. So, how is color different from shape, time, and space? Anyway, like first, if we can only perceive the world through humans' eyes, our perceptions of shape, time, and space is also relative to each other. Like, shapes, if you break everything down to it, everything's turned to molecules and then atoms, but there is no actual description of the shape of those molecules or atoms either. And if you break them down to quarks and stuff like that, you keep breaking down. Like, how is even shape, time, and space is a primarily and how it's not?
Do you want me to answer that in my early modern voice or my like 21st century voice?
Both.
Okay. So in wearing my early modern hat, here's one difference. So let's say I'm looking at a red triangle, right? So in that thought bubble, the red should be a red triangle. How do we explain the redness in that thought bubble? Well, by attributing size, shape, motion to the sun, size, shape, motion to the red triangle, size, shape, motion to like particles of air that are like bouncing around, size, shape, motion to my eyes, and so forth. No redness. So it seems like you can fully explain your experience of redness without ever mentioning color. On the other hand, they think, when you want to explain how triangularity gets in the thought bubble, how you perceive shape, they think that part of that explanatory story will mention the shapes of things out there in the world. So part of the story is going to be the shape of the sun, or the light source, the shape of the object. So you're going to have to mention shapes and time and space in your explanatory story. So insofar as like shapes, space, time, explanatory work, that gives you some reason to treat color and space, shape, time differently. Okay. In the early modern period, there are people who resist this. So Berkeley famously is like, color and shape, can't separate them. If color is in the mind, so is shape. Leibniz goes that way too. Okay, so that's my answer wearing my early modern hat. So physics has changed a lot since the 17th century, right? Like we no longer accept mechanical hypothesis. We no longer think that it's like little pellets bouncing around. We talk about molecules, atoms, quarks, subatomic particles that we don't describe in terms of shape exactly, or solidity definitely, like an atom isn't solid really in the way that a table is solid. And maybe you think that physics can give a complete explanation of everything in like our life and experience. Well, if that's what you think, if you think that our current physics can explain everything, and you're willing to go along with this idea that you should only believe in those entities' properties that do explanatory work, then it seems like you should only believe in the entities and properties that physicists talk about now. And that's going to lead you to deny the existence of all kinds of stuff. So here are some things that physicists don't talk about. They don't talk about color, right? They don't talk about taste. They don't talk about beauty. They don't talk about justice. They don't talk about knowledge. They don't talk about people. So that might make you suspicious of whether we should be accepting some of the presuppositions of the explanatory argument. So like, what is the basic idea behind the argument from explanation? Should only believe in those entities and properties that do explanatory work. First thought. Second thought. And physics, whether it's like the physics of the 17th century or the physics of the 21st century. That's the discipline that tells you what the true explanation is. Put those together, almost nothing exists. Almost none of the things we care about exist. And like honestly, I care more about color and people and goodness and beauty than some. Well, let me say that again. I am more confident in the reality of goodness, beauty, color, justice, people than I am in the correctness of the explanatory argument. So here's one way you can refute an argument. Show that it has some absurd conclusion you cannot possibly accept. And if you get to that point, you know that something has gone wrong with the argument, right? So you need to go back and figure out what's wrong with it. So maybe that's a good way to end our talk. So if you think this explanatory argument will lead you to a conclusion that you cannot possibly accept, then it's on you to diagnose what was wrong with the argument. And that is not easy to do.
Thank you all for your attention. I feel that this conversation could go on for another hour. And there are a lot of stones left unturned, so please stick around and ask questions to Professor Chamberlain. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
And thank you for all your questions. Feel free to email me. I think my email is on my Temple page anyway, so you can find it pretty easily. I'm happy to do that kind of stuff.